Continue reading, this time the sister from the past. Judging from the amount of luggage, Dina was not visiting. She was prepared to move in with us, and we lived in a single room. My father had a sister in Columbus, Ohio, and whenever he spoke of her, he chuckled. Back a generation, when they had been children in Poland, they had been at odds in usual brother and sister fashion, or perhaps more than usual. Dina, as my father told it, had a special fondness for flowers. She spent the better part of her days attending row after row of flower pots, which were artfully arranged around the four walls of her bedroom, some even hanging from the ceiling. In hasty revenge for a spat between them, my father broke into her room and systematically smashed every single flower pot. They were very young then, my father and his sister, but from that point on, relations between them were difficult, as you'd expect, especially from her side. Of course, from that time in the early 1900s to early in the 1950s, the world had flip-flopped once and twice. The family had been scattered, and there were deaths, marriages, births, and for those who survived, aging. Dina was about 10 years older than my father, which put her near 60. She must be an old woman now, my father would say, then he'd chuckle. Still, the memory of the smashing of the flower pots, as though nothing else had ever happened between them. I asked my father why, after all this time, he made no attempt to get together with her, all these years apart. They were brother and sister, after all. Wasn't he curious? Not really, but he did write her anyway, and she returned a 20-page letter filled on both sides with an outpouring of sibling lovesickness. She was a widow, she wrote, had raised 4 boys, and now she was alone. Could she come visit? A year later, my father wrote back, saying yes. We met her at the train station, and an old woman she was, all right. How would he greet her, I wondered, given the span between them? Sure enough, there were no hugs, no kisses, only a nod from the two of them. None of the emotions you usually see from others at a time like these. I thought, did she also remember the flower pots? Or was it just the way things were in our family? My father, as I've already said, lived by King Solomon's dictums, "This too shall pass." The entire family, then, lived by this code that made them so terse and unloving, at least on the surface. Judging from the amount of luggage, Dina was not visiting. She was prepared to move in with us, and we lived in a single room. There she stayed with us and grew more disenchanted each day. Throughout that time, there was absolutely nothing between my father and his sister. No reminiscing, no shared memories, nothing. Nothing to show them as relatives, as friends, or even as strangers. As for me, Dina kept aloof, except for her questions. What astonished her was our poverty. She hadn't the courage to ask my father directly, what would he smash now? So she asked me. When she'd find me alone, she'd say, "Why no money? Why are you so poor?" As if it were my fault, or as if it were my father's fault. I had no answers for her questions. In fact, is there an answer for such a question? Why are you poor? I mean, what can you say except that I am poor because I have no money. I have no money because I am poor. To defend my father, I once said, "He works very hard." She said, "Yes, but—" Financially, she'd done well in America. To her mind, if you worked hard, you made money. How sensible. Except life was not sensible. Because of her thinking, she even suspected that my father did make good money, but squandered it away. What, she asked me, does he do with the money? That I could not answer either. I told my father about her questions, and he too was stumped, not to mention embarrassed, humbled, and humiliated. Yet he never reproved her for the discord she was planting in our home. But he did have hard feelings against her. But I did have hard feelings against her. She used to call me Yaki instead of Jack or Jackie or Yakov or Yanko. More than anything, more than her questions, this is what made me dislike her. I could like her, I thought, if only she would stop calling me Yaki. Why didn't I ask her to stop? Because even at this young age, I was amazed at how nothing works out. This was just another one of those things. Anyway, this too shall pass. Finally, I said to my father, "She calls me Yaki, you know." "No," he said. "I don't like the name." "I'll talk to her," he said. The next day she did not call me Yaki. She drew me to her, tears in her eyes, hugged me, kissed me, and kept repeating, "Yakov, Yakov, Yakov." A day later, she was packed and gone. I'll continue on to number 15. The Fairmount Synagogue Choir. The Fairmount Synagogue Choir was something wonderful. The synagogue was famous for its grand architecture and its cantor, who had an international reputation. But the choir, a sweet collection of young voices, made it special above all else. People came from everywhere to hear this choir, which was led by the temperamental and even violent Israel Korbik. Mr. Korbik terrorized the choir boys, and this was no small thing. These were the Jewish toughs from Esplanade, Saint-Urbain, Jean Mance. Even after a Sabbath performance, decked out in the splendor of white tunics, chanting such praises as "Holy, holy, holy," nothing holy transpired in the alley back of the synagogue, where fights broke out between us just for the sake of a fight. My mother used to say, "I send you to shul just to come home with a bloody nose." There was one untouchable among us. This was Ronnie Stone. He was our peer, but only in age. In virtually every other way he was superior. He was our soloist, and had so clear and fine a voice that it was said to ascend through all 13 heavenly gates of prayer. Even Mr. Korbik was in awe of him. The way he talked to the rest of us, harshly and impatiently, was not the way he talked to Ronnie. The way he punched, pinched, smacked, and booted the rest of us, well, certainly that was not his way with Ronnie. Unlike the usual seating arrangements where the best students begin from the right and left of the master, we saw to it that the newest and worst member was seated nearest to Mr. Korbik, to be ready and accessible for Mr. Korbik's blows. As for me, I was always, it seemed, the newest and the worst. As Ronnie was one extreme, I was the other. I had no voice. I did not even have an ear. I was surprised to hear this. My father had once visited Mr. Corbick to find out how I was doing. "He says you have no ear," my father reported. I took it literally. Mr. Corbick liked to hit me. The Sabbath, our day of holy rest, became for me a day of dreaded conflict. On the Sabbath I was beaten publicly, before the entire congregation. This was unjust because the sour notes Mr. Corbick was hearing came not from me. Usually I mouthed the words. I faked the singing, except for Amen, at which I was very good. Thus I was the scapegoat, and perhaps for that reason I was important to the other choir boys. Now for Sabbath and festivals we performed in the center of the sanctuary, assembled in a semicircle on a platform. There were special occasions, however, when we were above, on the upper tier, hidden from the view in the women's section. That was the case on Sundays, when we sat at weddings. On Sundays, by the way, Mr. Corbick paid us for the week. He paid us what he thought we were worth, and sometimes I got nothing, which goes to show how unfair it was when you are paid on merit. Once in December, 2 very rich and influential families were being united in marriage. I knew this because all of us were to be there that Sunday, when for most weddings only the best were selected. Ronnie, of course, was the main attraction. He sang "Because." But for this wedding, I was included, and I asked Mr. Corbick where we'd be singing, down in public or up out of view. "Why do you want to know?" asked Mr. Corbick, his eyes blazing and fist coiled to strike. What had I asked that was so dangerous? Nothing. Except Mr. Corbick hated everything about me. "Upstairs," Mr. Corbick finally said, but not to me. I heard him tell Ronnie and was privileged to overhear. Overhearing was how I was spoken to in the choir room. I was not important enough to be told anything directly, and Ronnie, of course, never talked to me, since I was immortal. Upstairs. That meant I could wear whatever I wanted, even stay in my boots, since nobody would see us, and as it happened, it did snow that Sunday. And though we were all changed into our white tunics, I kept my boots on, dripping mud and snow. But so what? We would be going upstairs, usually using a back stairway. For a moment, instinct told me to remove my boots, in case of a change of plans. But I kept my boots on even though I was some contrast, white linen covering my body, boots covering my feet. My instinct had been right. As we filed out the choir room, Mr. Corbick said, "They want us downstairs." There was no time to remove my boots, and with these terrible boots I stormed through the carpeted aisles of the sanctuary. My boots spoiled the mood of the whole business. The wedding guests pointed. Some laughed. Some gasped. Mr. Corbick gradually became aware of the commotion, but not the cause. Who could it be, except me? He glanced me up and down, beheld my boots, and in his face I saw murder. Right after this he fired me. He said, "You're fired. Don't come back." I took the hint, and returned only now and then, as a Sabbath worshipper. From afar, once again, the choir was so beautiful.